and you are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Birgit Schreiber via the mobile phone from Freiburg, Germany. She's the Vice President of the International Association of Student Affairs and Services. She's also the co-editor of the recently published Student Affairs and Services in Higher Education, Global Foundations, Issues and Best Practices, as well as she's the co-founder and editorial executive for the Journal of Student Affairs in Africa. And I would like to welcome Birgit Schreiber. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on two major awards that you have received most recently. The first one relates to Noam Chomsky Research Achievement Award, and the other one from NASPA, or the National Association of Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, that to me demonstrates your absolute dedication and commitment to students in higher education. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
What is the purpose of higher education?
Lisa, I saw that question and I thought it's such a complex question, and I was wondering how to simplify and how to answer it. And I wondered if I can perhaps position the question and say the question has a locality and a time in which we ask the question. So I think that there is never an ultimate purpose of higher education that always and absolutely exists. So perhaps I can just say I come from a place of having taught and lived in Africa for most of my life, having worked and taught also here in Europe and in the United States. And so I place myself in this time and in this perhaps geographical space and want to answer the question from this vantage point. So the one, I think that we can divide it, or in my mind, I think we can divide the purpose into three purposes. The one I think of higher education is, of course, education for knowledge, for skills, for acquiring disciplinary expertise, for contributing to society in meaningful ways that is disciplinary based, being employed gainfully, and that kind of thing. So it's developing a knowledge set and insights and attitudes. The second purpose, and here I'm relying very much on the Humboldtian approach to education, is about locating ourselves in a relational way with the world and with the people around us. So the purpose of higher education is to locate the person in relationship to others, to be socially responsible, to be aware of oneself in the world, to contribute to social justice, to be a global citizen, a local citizen. And that means really contributing to one's life and the people around us in ways that makes a better life for everyone. And that's really, and let me add the third one quickly, is just the aspect of the individual, that the purpose of higher education is also about liberating the self and asserting one's identity, or finding one's identity and understanding oneself and one's unique place in the world. So it's individual, oneself with the world, and then it's knowledge.
Okay. So why did you choose to become an educator or teacher in the first place?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question, because that wasn't really my choice as such when I was young. I started off studying psychology and worked as a psychologist, psychotherapist for a lot of my working life, and was fascinated with the intrapsychic processes, the processes that motivate us, the processes that that help us find who we are, identify who we are, And then slowly I kind of worked a bit more in groups and in couples and in families, and I was more interested in the intrapersonal, in just how groups work, how students such as peers with one another work. And slowly I got to kind of manage these divisions in universities, and I kind of slipped a little bit into management. And now I'm working on a much more sectoral level, on a much more macro level. So I kind of did a sort of interesting trajectory from an intrapsychic lens and being fascinated by what goes on inside of a person and the psychic principles that that govern who we are, or that guide, or that play out who we are, slowly into kind of who the person is in the world, and then an educator, and then the focus on the context within which a student studies. And so I suppose my trajectory was from the interpersonal towards the much more macro level functioning of people.
Right. Now, you are the Vice President of the International Association of Student Affairs and Services. Can you share the work of the organization?
Right, yes. So the work, excuse me. So the work of the International Association for Student Affairs and Services is really to build networks and to build knowledge base and to build a network of student affairs practitioners and student affairs scholarship right across the globe. So we have about 1,700 members in all regions of the world. And we come together in various forms, in various ways. So we have a global summit that takes place every 2 years, where we deliberate and discuss issues that concern all of us across the world. We have association meetings. That means where we have all the associations that are within the countries or within regions, the heads of these associations come together and have debates about what concerns all of us, perhaps the SDGs, or professionalization, or access of students and their, how do we broaden access for students in universities and so forth. So these shared kind of issues is what excites us and what brings us together.
So thinking about the pandemic and post-pandemic times, I know you've written something about this, but so I'm just curious from your perspective, what do you think are some of the lessons and challenges professionals dedicated to supporting the academic and personal development of students attending colleges or universities today?
Right. That's really interesting, because COVID in many ways has shone a light on the difficulties that many of us were already aware of. So our students come with huge abilities and motivations and skills into the sector, into the higher education studies, into these studies. And yet often what holds them back are contextual factors. So it's factors of poverty, of crime, of violence, of gender-based violence, of family distress, unemployment in the family, perhaps gender roles, and particularly female students are often held back. So we know that the pandemic has shed a light on these contextual factors that are impairing our students from being successful. So I think that what COVID has really done for us is telling us that this is not just about a student being successful or a student needing perhaps a scholarship to be successful, but that we need to put an effort into the contextual factors. And these contextual factors are issues like transport, safety, Wi-Fi access, running water, safe accommodation, safe access to and from campus, our curricula, what do we teach, how do we teach? So, we're looking kind of at education being successful, not because we have very bright students, but because we need conditions around students that are supportive of their studying efforts.
So what do you think of technology? How do you think the technology supported students, or what happened to those students who did not have access to technology?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because technology is one aspect that enables a student or helps us in being successful. Now, technology, we do need much broader technological sort of access. We need Wi-Fi spots that are much more reliable. I mean, some of our networks are full of holes and are fragile and so forth. So we need better technological and more predictable and more safe and more stable access, that's for sure. But that's just one aspect of a student being successful. If a student studies on their cell phone, on their mobile phones, or they sit under wherever they may sit in a coffee shop or in a shopping center, wherever, on their laptops, that's not enough to help a student really gain the kind of education we were talking about right in the beginning. So, through these sorts of e-courses, we can do micro-credentials, we can offer short courses in a little knowledge bite or in a knowledge unit and so forth. But really helping students educate themselves and becoming a citizen of the world, for that to happen, we need much more than just electronic education or e-education or technological education. So while it's enabled a much broader access to knowledge for sure, and that has been revolutionary, I mean, that's been amazing how more students and more female students and also returning and what we call the non-traditional students, returning mature students being able to study and having access to knowledge. But we need the conditions around that to be much more supportive of learning.
So when we think about these practitioners and the support services, what kind of support would you say are absolutely crucial today that has not really been considered, say, before the pandemic or COVID?
I've lost you for a second. Can you just repeat that question?
Yes, sure. Sorry. So what I'm asking is, now you talk about that the technological support is not enough. I'm just curious about what other support would you be saying are missing in order that, before, I mean, even before pandemic, I'm sure there were issues.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's right. So these are quite interesting. We've just done a global research on the impact of COVID on student affairs practice. So student affairs practice used to be, or its lens used to focus on the student and her ability to negotiate the higher education space. So her ability to study successfully, to manage her psychological wellness, and so forth and so forth. And what we found through the COVID period is that student affairs lens has gotten broader. So we now find student affairs supporting students personally and psychologically and socially and also academically, but more so also lobbying for students' context outside of the university and out of the campus. So we're now worrying about student safety at home, students' transport when they come, finally, if they do come to campus, students' visa issues, students' health back at home, students being able to protect their time back at home when they perhaps have to look after family members or, do whatever they need to do at home. So the lens of student affairs has shifted since COVID. It's gotten much broader.
And so that also shows that we no longer have students who come from, if you like, the middle class families. It's also students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds that really that we also need to consider, because we have opened up our institutions, our higher education. We have opened up to become more inclusive. Now that is a positive aspect, but on the other hand, we still seem to exclude students.
That's right. I think what you're pointing out is absolutely true. We've made huge strides in becoming more accessible to people from all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. But I think what tends to happen is that the world in higher education, so the campuses, are geared towards reflecting the world, very much middle class values. And so it can be alienating, it can be excluding to those who don't recognize themselves in this higher education campus world that is very much, normative, middle class kind of, values in a sense. And that has to do with, also diversity. How do we affirm and enable diverse lives and diverse beings? And when people make choices in their life choices around diversity, how affirming are we of that on our campuses, in our studies, or in our university spaces? And student affairs lobbies very much for that. Student affairs levels the playing field, so to speak, makes it possible for people at the edges of everything, at the edges, at the margins, to feel that they can be included, to feel that they are engaged, to feel that they can participate. That is what student affairs is, what drives student affairs. Yeah.
How would you define or can you explain the differences between equity, equality, and inclusion? This is,
Lisa, let me try. So equality is when we do the same for people. That means we perhaps give everybody a book and say, here is an equal treatment of students. Each one gets one book for Maths 101 or whatever it might be. Here is your book, go home and study. So that would be equality of access. So we give them the same tools to access education. Equity is based on the needs of the person. So we might want to say, well, a person who just needs a book, we give that person a book, let's say in Maths 101, here you go home and study. We might say, for somebody who might be blind, we make sure that the book is in Braille or has some disability enabler or a device that makes the person able to read the book. Or somebody who doesn't, can't carry a book or whatever, because we can't give the book to because they might be far away. They only have electronic access to this book. We give them an e-copy of that book. So equity is when we give diverse responses depending on the diverse needs of the other. It's much more than that even. So we don't just offer education in diverse and multiple ways, but we also test the person in multiple ways. So equitable assessment or equitable teaching and learning includes this kind of assessment via diverse media. Might that be an essay, a multiple choice, a presentation, a drama piece, a song, whatever it is. So we assess people in different ways. Your third was inclusion. And inclusion has to do with, now I'm going to be very careful here. Inclusion is when we do something that enables equitable participation of the others. So inclusion is when we open up our spaces in such ways that a multiple range of people feel that they are, that they can participate in the process. You have done some research that explore student affairs and service practitioners' use of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to guide student development and support practice. So yes, I think the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are on everybody's list, and I think we all are aware of them, and some more and some less. But certainly over the last 6 months, they've become a guiding framework for all of us to, it's a very ambitious plan. It's a sort of first set of goals where the whole world says, let's hold hands and let's see how we can together and be of one, we are on one planet. How do we share a set of goals that guides all of our behavior? So it's really, it's a hugely ambitious social justice framework for all of us. So it's been guiding in terms of that. And what we found, though, when we did some research on asking student affairs practitioners across the globe, and we asked them, how have the SDGs been guiding for you? In what way do you use them? How do you use them? We've gotten some very interesting replies. So we did an online survey, and we got replies from 7 regions, for all the regions across the globe, and we found that 80%, 81% actually of respondents noted that they were familiar, somewhat familiar with the SDGs and how they can impact their work with students. Interestingly, the responses from North America and Europe were less likely to say yes. And what is really fascinating is that the majority of the Global South were very, very familiar with the SDGs, more so than how we found in North America. And that was really interesting.
So why do you think that is?
Well, yeah, no, you're right to say it's difficult to know why, because the work that goes on in North American universities and European universities, the SDGs are infused into the work, and the SDGs are infused in many of the public processes and policies. And I'm just not sure whether in North America and Europe it's perhaps not quite as explicit, but the awareness was not as explicit. Yeah, so we need to think about kind of why. I'm not too sure exactly of the why, but what we did find was a more of an explicit, yes, I'm familiar with the SDGs, yes, I use the SDGs with the work with students, I use the SDGs with guiding my presence, my design of my curriculum, of my programs with students, and so forth. The question is, do we do explicit alignment of our curricula with the SDGs? And I'm not so sure whether we are doing it explicitly, or if we just have a socially just curriculum and we think, oh, it all falls into place and I'll tick a box. And yes, I think we are thinking about sustainability. But I'm not sure whether we are deliberate enough about the SDGs, particularly in the global north. There is, and I think the SDGs themselves as a document can improve a lot. I mean, there's some areas in the SDGs that, for instance, the goal 4, which is the higher education, access to higher education goal. Higher education isn't spread across all the other goals. And so there's much more work needed to make sure that higher education becomes a powerful tool to achieve the SDGs. That is not very explicit in the current document. And also, the SDGs, particularly SDG 4, which is of course close to me, with my heart, they're not explicit about broadening access and broadening the sector. It speaks about ensuring access to higher education, but it doesn't speak about broadening the sector dramatically, particularly in areas like Africa or Asia and, in areas where it's desperately needed. So the SDGs, there's areas for improvement. I mean, one example, just to give you an example, it speaks, I think it's a target 4.3 or something in SDG 4. It speaks about strengthening scholarship and a funding flow towards students and making sure that students have got funding to access higher education. And of course, when we think about scholarships for individual students, we assume that that's a trickle-down effect, that these students then would somehow teach others or somehow empower their communities. I'm not quite sure. But it's a very elitist way of thinking about access to higher education. So the SDGs, there's some areas for improvement, particularly, for instance, that target 4.3, where it speaks about scholarships. Scholarship as a form of funding for students is not a very successful one for entire communities. It might be successful, funding one student, but it doesn't enable entire countries to broaden access to higher education. So we've got a little bit of work to do in terms of the SDGs, moving towards the SDG 2.0 perhaps, and thinking about how the SDGs can be improved.
What kind of skills do you think are necessary in, right now as we are speaking about the Sustainable Development Goals? What skills do you think are important for teachers? For
teachers to teach the SDGs? speak about a skill set. Skills, I find, and perhaps what I think is more important is to create an awareness of ourselves in the world. That has to do with kind of teaching an international curriculum and saying, how do we teach a curriculum, or how do we teach and facilitate knowledge in our students that locates them in this world as a citizen of the world? How do we teach something that makes a student realize that whatever they do, that it has an environmental footprint. It has that we need to think about when we source products from elsewhere in the world, what are the human rights or the working conditions of these products when we buy products from elsewhere in the world. So I think it's not so much about a skill set. It's more about making sure our students have a deep sense of themselves as being in the world and being responsible for one another in the world. So I'm kind of keen on an international curriculum that speaks, an international curriculum that brings the world into your curriculum rather than kind of teaching a skill about the SDGs.
How would you define internationalization?
Well, so first let's think about internationalization and what it means for the curriculum and what it means for engaging students in the higher education space. So internationalization, we call it internationalization at home, meaning that we teach and we engage students with an international lens. So we always teach something that is local, that is here, that is now, that is relevant, but always in relation to the other, always in relation to other people, to other knowledges, to other sources of knowledge, to whatever it is. So it has international curricula or relational curricula or curricula that teach a person or that create an awareness of the person in the world. And it translates into teaching different, it might be architectural models, it might be pharmaceutical models, it might be whatever it is. It's international knowledge. It comes from different sources of the world. So it's pluralistic knowledge, but it's also the process of teaching. So we make sure that our visa processes are in place. We make sure that our administrative processes are such that international students can join, be that in an we're joining online and hybrid spaces, but that they can join our courses. And I mean, the online learning has been phenomenal around this, making it possible that people from right across the globe have come together. I mean, just to go back to the International Association of Student Affairs and Services, I mean, we've had since our Global Summit in Toronto in 21, we've had all our meetings in hybrid and international and online spaces, and the Global Summit also in online. And it's been phenomenal. We've got people from 90 countries sitting together and debating issues and introducing their countries and introducing their issues and sharing what it means living in Andorra. We even have a member from Andorra, We have a member from right across the globe, and the online space has made that possible. So just to say, international curricula are bringing international and pluralistic thinking into the local space. What else did we spoke about kind of globalization. And there I think, I think people like Hans de Wit and Philip Albach would be better at defining it. But I think some of the risk of the globalization is the generic, that the idea that there is something generic that applies to everyone and that everybody ought to know it. So I think that where globalization has some of those risks of speaking about the generic and diluting individual experience and individual local relevance.
Mm-hmm. What is next for you? You are a very busy person.
That's great, Lisa. I'm not too sure. I think when I look at the last 20 years of my work and how it's gone from an individual to groups, to institutions, and now at a sectorial level, and being more active in the international space and teaching across kind of borders. I would like to do more of the international research and also teach more in the international spaces and make sure that we bring pluralism and pluralistic awareness into a very local experience. So blending the international with the local. I think that for me is a very exciting space.
Fantastic. What a wonderful response. Go ahead.
No, the one interesting area that I'm doing a paper on, speaking about decolonizing student affairs practice. What kind of has come with the history of student affairs? What have we inherited from perhaps patriarchal knowledges, perhaps colonial knowledges, perhaps global north knowledges? What are we at risk of simply importing into a global south? And I think that that's quite interesting at the moment anyway. For me, that is very, very exciting. And so I'm spending some time thinking and reading about that.
So is there anything in your thought right now that you would like to talk about that you wanted to talk more about, but I rudely must have interrupted with questions?
No, Lisa, this has been fantastic. I mean, your questions have been really exciting, and it's made it possible for me to explain how, I think that we have a discourse. There's kind of this risk of a discourse of the autonomy of a student, that a student is an individual and we look towards a student to be successful. And that kind of relying on the autonomous student, on the individual, while it has a lot of relevance, there is a risk of us neglecting what it looks like from a contextual space, and that we cannot kind of give individual support, scholarship support, or just looking at the individual and pointing at an individual saying it's in your responsibility to be successful or not, if we don't enable a context that is conducive towards success.
Thank you so much for your time. And Birgit, happy 2023.
Thank you, Lisa. Same to you. I wish you a successful and happy and healthy 23, and same to your listeners. And thank you very much for giving me the time to share my thoughts with you.
And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.